The door slid open without warning, and Jake Morgan barely had time to look up from his datapad before. She walked in. She was tall and moved with the kind of confidence that made the air feel different in her skin. Had this faint blue shimmer under the ship lights, like someone had mixed twilight into her DNA, and those eyes were amber and bright and focused. Right on him, she smiled, not a polite smile or a friendly smile, but the kind of smile that said she already knew something he didn't. Jake sat up straighter in his bunk, and his hand moved toward the come button on the wall, but stopped halfway, because she wasn't doing anything threatening, and she just stood there in the doorway with her arms crossed and that smile still on her face. "Are Jake Morgan?" she said. And it wasn't a question, Nia, he said slowly, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "And who are Yower?" Name was Lyra, and she said it like it was supposed to mean something, and maybe it did, because the way she looked at him made his brain go fuzzy around the edge. Took a step inside, and the door closed behind her with a soft hiss, and Jake noticed she was wearing something that looked like armor, but moved like cloth, and it was dark and fit her like. It had been grown on her body. Lyra walked closer and stopped right at the foot of his bunk and tilted her head like she was studying something interesting. "Ye have been watching you," she said. That should have been creepy, but the way she said it made it sound almost casual, like she was talking about the weather. Jake swallowed and okay. "Why? Because you were different," she said, and leaned forward just a little, and her eyes seemed to glow brighter in the dim light of his quarters. "Different? How he?" "Oskadu do not fear us," she said simply, "and most humans do." Jake thought about that, and it was true that most of the crew kept their distance from the alien delegates who had boarded the vessel 2 weeks ago, and the alliance between Earth and the Kethera was new and fragile, and everyone walked on eggshells, but Jake had always been curious more than careful. "So you broke into my room? 'Cause I am not scared of you," he said. Lyra laughed, and it was a low sound that seemed to vibrate in his chesty. "Did not break in," she said, "and your door was not locked." Jake felt his face heat up, because that was true, and he had gotten too comfortable on the ship and stopped locking his door months ago. He said, "And this is kind offerward," she finished. For him, and her smile widened, and Yeshi moved then and sat down on the edge of his bunk without asking, and the mattress dipped under her weight, and Jake found himself pressed back against the wall, her turn to face him fully, and crossed her legs, and her knee brushed against his thigh. "You humans are strange," she said, "and you build walls everywhere, and around your ships, and around your hearts, and around your baddish." Jake tried to focus on her words instead of how close she was. "Like our privacy," he said. "Privacy," she repeated, and tested the word like it was foreign. "And yes, I understand this concept, but it is inefficient. Venti," Jake said, and laughed. "Despite himself and how Sobcause you spend so much energy keeping others out," she said, "and when you could spend that energy letting others in." Her hand moved and rested on his knee, and her fingers were long and warm. Through the fabric of his uniform, pants, Jake Lyra watched his face carefully, and "among my people," she said, "and touch is how we communicate and how we bond and how we understand." Jake managed to find his voice, and you want to understand, Maze," she said simply, "and I want to understand why you are not afraid," because he started and stopped and tried again, "because you have not given me a reason to be her." Expression shifted, and something softer moved through those bright eyes. "I said quiet." Lithe sat there for a moment, and the only sound was the low hum of the ship in Genistan. Lyra moved again, and this time she reached up and touched his face, and her palm was warm against his cheek, and her thumb traced his. "Jalanu have scars," she observed. "Adia," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, "and lots of people debote." "Yours tell a story," she said, and leaned closer until he could feel her breath against his skin-wet story. He asked. "You survive," she said, "and that you fight, and that you do not give up." Her face was so close now that Jake could see the tiny patterns in her skin like constellation maps, and her eyes were locked on his, and he felt like he was falling into them. "Lyra," she said, and seemed to be waiting for something. He managed, "May I kiss you?" His skeggic brain short-circuited for a second, because he had not expected that level of directness. He said, and yes, she smiled again, and this time it was different and warmer and less predatory, and then she closed the distance between them. Her lips were soft and tasted faintly like something sweet and electric, and Jake stopped thinking and just responded, and his hands came up to her waist and pulled. Her closer Liara made a sound low in her throat and shifted. And suddenly she was straddling his lap, and her hands were in his hair, and the kiss deep in him seemed to stop and stretch, and Jake forgot where they were, and forgot that this was probably breaking about 17 different regulations, and forgot everything except the feeling of her against him when she finally pulled. Back they were both breathing hard. That was she started intensely, finished Shadiz. She agreed, and her smile was back, but softer now, and good Jake laughed.
Ow.
Breathlessly, and Yagud Lara slid her hands down to rest on his shoulders and studied his face. Again, you are even more interesting up close, she said. Thanks. He said dryly, and I think she kissed him again before he could finish the sentence, and this time it was slower and deeper, and Jake felt like he was drowning in the best possible way. Hands moved to the collar of his uniform, and she pulled back just enough to look at him questioning. Kehi Sachi smiled and started unfastening the clasps with practiced ease, and Jake wondered distantly how much she had studied human clothing. But then her fingers brushed against his skin, and he stopped wondering about anything. Uniform jacket hit the floor, and Lyra ran her hands over his chest and traced the lines of old scars with her fingertips. Had been hurt many times, she said softly. Comes with the job. He said, what job? She asked. Kengon engineer, he said, and I go places that are breaking and fix them. She nodded slowly, and that explains much. What does it explain? He Iskedwi, you are not afraid of me, she said, and you are? Used to dangerous things. Jake reached up and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, and it felt like silk between his fingers. Are not dangerous, he said. Lyra laughed. And oh, I am very dangerous, she said. And but not to you, not he Iskedbekos, she said, and leaned down until her forehead rested against his, and you see Mayaki did not know what to say to that, so he just kissed her. Aganthi fell back onto the bunk together, and Lyra was warm and solid against him, and her hands were everywhere. And Jake gave up on thinking entirely. Somewhere in the back of his mind he knew this was crazy, and knew this was going to complicate everything, and knew that tomorrow he would have to face the consequence. But right now, in this moment with her lips on his neck and her body pressed against his, he could not bring himself to Lyra pulled back suddenly and looked at him with those bright amber eyes. Sir, you certain? She asked. About what he said about this, she said, and gestured between them. And about Majaki sat up enough to cup her face in his hands. He am certain he's sad. She smiled, and it was the most genuine expression he had seen on her face yet. Good, she said, and kissed him against ship, hummed around them, and the stars moved past. Outside the viewport, and Jake Morgan let himself foul at her when they were tangled together in the narrow bunk, and Lyra was tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertips. Said quiet. Lyra was quiet for a long moment because, yes, she said finally, and when I look at you, I see someone who chooses curiosity over fear, and that is, a right is rare among humans. He Iskedit is rare among anyone, she said. Jake processed that. Alliance, he said, and is it going to work? Lyra shifted against him, and I do not know, she said honestly, and there is much fear on both sides, and much distrust. But he prompted, but she said, and if there are more like you and more like me who are willing to reach across the gap, and then Maybesh did not finish the sentence, but Jake understood, are a bridge. He said. She smiled against his shoulder, and yes, she said, and a very scandalous bridge. Jake laughed, and yeah. Probably thee will not approve, she said. Probably not, he agreed. And do you? Lyra lifted her head to look at him, and no, she said. And do you? Jake thought about it, and thought about the regulations, and the chain of command, and the delicate political situation, and he thought about the way she smiled at him, and the way she had walked into his room like she belonged there, and the way she made him feel like the universe was bigger and brighter than he had ever imagined it. He said, and I do not care. Good, she said, and settled back against him. Thea lay there in comfortable silence until Jake spoke again. So, What happens now, he asked. Lyra hummed thoughtfully, and now she said, and we see what comes next. That is not very specific, he said. She laughed, and no, it is not. Jake found himself smiling. And okay then, Kay, she agreed. Door chime beeped suddenly, and they both froze. Morgan, a voice called from outside. Shh, he called back, and be right there. Footsteps retreated down the corridor. Lyra sat up and stretched, and her movements were fluid and gracefully. Should go, she said. Probably, Jake agreed reluctantly, stood, and started gathering her things.